in the hills, but welcome at the Institute of Mediterranean Studies. This is our first lecture with physical presence, as we say, of this year, 2022-2023. And we're extremely happy to have you here and open our series of lectures. We are very honored to have Fernando. I always have a problem. Guirao, Fernando Guirao. It doesn't matter, it's all right. Well, so Fernando Guirao is presently is professor at the he's professor at the University of Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona, and he's presently deputy director of the Barcelona Center for European Studies. And he's also professor of European integration history and of many histories, as he says. You will see that. He's got a wide spectrum. He's been educated. He's got his a PhD at the European University Institute in Florence. And he did his master's degree at Madrid. Yeah, University of Madrid. And at the University of Madrid, his first degree was in modern and contemporary history. Okay, so we are. That's all right. It's just yesterday. So, so he's written many books, but one of his last books is The European Rescue of the Franco Regime, which has been published by Oxford University Press, and he's got another 2 books coming, of which he will talk to us about, and so. The floor is yours, and we thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for coming today. I hope not to disappoint you too much. And also let me express my appreciation to Christos Sakas, who is the responsible. You can blame him afterwards. He is the main responsible of me being here. Thank you very much to the Institute for the invitation. The talk that I have to deliver today to you is the most difficult talk I have had in my entire life, because I need to talk about something that is already published, and there I normally talk about work in progress. And when you talk about work in progress, that you have your own problems in your mind and you're trying to get the solutions from the audience. Now here, and the only thing that I could get for the audience is basically criticisms concerning the contents of the book. I'm gonna, just for you to have the book, it's a beautiful piece. I don't know about the contents, that's you will have to say about that, but I mean the cover is lovely. I mean, that cover is absolutely lovely. When I have to talk about this book, the first thing that I have to say is basically that this book is part of a long-term project. If I should go this way, is that working? Should go this way? Oh, I'm sorry about that. And then. Yes. From University of the Netherlands, and he is He was visiting Barcelona. I met him visiting Barcelona. He was presenting his PhD, so I was very much involved because his research and my research, both researchers have a lot of elements in common. That's why he wants me to come here to tell you my story. Now, what I said is that, I mean, the book, this book, which is going through, is part of a very long-term project. It's part of the very long-term project that has basically 5 volumes, all right? The first one was published by Macmillan when Macmillan was Macmillan. This is the second volume. The third volume is coming up. The third volume is basically a comparative analysis of the European community's policy towards dictatorships. And that means the Greek junta, the Spanish Franco regime, also includes Yugoslavia and Portugal. So it's going to be a comparative perspective. This book is a new creation because the European rescue of the Franco regime should have had 2 volumes, but at the end, I just managed to get 1 volume because of problems with the publisher. So the second volume, the contents of the second volume, I decided not to do a European Rescue 2. I said, let's get one part and put it into a comparative perspective. So I incorporated Greece, Portugal, Yugoslavia, and Spain. Why these countries? Why these 4 countries? Because these were the only 4 dictatorships that had formal relations with the European community. And what I care, and that is the core argument of my research here, what I care is basically the capacity of the European community to reduce repression by dictatorships, to increase representation, and to have maintained, develop, let's say, liberal market policies. So the idea is basically the capacity of the European community to change the life of the citizens living in a dictatorship. I'm not saying that the European community can transform a dictatorship into a democracy. That has never happened, and it will never happen. The European community or the European Union nowadays doesn't have that capacity. But the European community should have had the capacity to use very powerful instrument, which are these institutionalized relations with dictators, to basically introduce some degree of conditionality in political and in economic terms, right? So what I'm doing in this, I have done that already with the Spanish regime. What I'm doing on the second volume is basically to get that in relationship with all these 4 dictatorships. And there are only 4 dictatorships because they were the only ones that had formal relationships with the European community. I don't care about the European community's policy concerning China because there was no institutionalized relation. And it's the institutional relation that matters because the institutional relation is an instrument that you can use to condition the performance, the economic, political performance of a dictatorship, all right? And this is something, once you read my book, you will get depressed. Once you read the European Rescue of the National State, you'll get depressed. But don't worry, there's a learning process. Once you get the second volume, you get even more depressed because you might think, after finishing the European Rescue of the Franco regime, well, that is specifically of the Spanish regime. I'm sorry. You'll be wrong. Exactly the same happened with the Greek junta, exactly the same happened with the Salazar regime, exactly the same happened with the communist regime in Yugoslavia. Exactly the same, because the European community had 2 problems. Those 2 problems are permanent structural elements of the European community up to date. That means also involves the European Union. The European Union and the European community back in those years was not able to generate political conditionality for many reasons, and I'm explaining some of them in this book. They didn't engineer political conditionality. Some members wanted to get political conditionality. Some members did not want to get political conditionality, and therefore the Commission wanted to get, that depends whether it was Monday or Tuesday, they wanted to get some political conditionality. It was Wednesday or Thursday, they decided not to do that. It was not a clear position. It was not a clear decision. And therefore, the community was not able to use political conditionality. Exactly the same is happening now. Exactly the same is happening now. The relationship of the European Union with dictators is basically based on a ideological perception. And that ideological perception is that the European Union and the European communities back in those years were so important so important that those countries willing to have relations with the European Union or the European community will make the effort to get some degree of political or economic convergence in order to get the goodies out of the European Union or the European community. Well, that book over there, The European Rescue of the Nation State, the European Rescue of the Franco Regime, will tell you that a dictatorship could get the maximum possible benefit out of the European community short of membership, which, by the way, dictators never want to be members of the European community or the European Union because they will have limited strongly their political autonomy. Therefore, the maximum, and I'm going to be talking about that in a minute, the maximum that the Franco regime wanted to obtain from the European community was granted by the European community without any political conditionality and without any mechanism of supervision. It is the most frustrating, from the European Union point of view, is the most frustrating attitude that you could ever imagine. We don't know anything about that. That's another feature which is important, is that we are not told that. I don't know whether there is anybody here who is an expert on the Greek junta. I don't know whether there is anybody here in this room who is expert on the relationships between the Greek junta and the European community. But maybe whoever is here is an expert, could tell us about the freezing of the association agreement. That was a big issue. That was a big issue. Now, if you go to Florence and you go to the European Union Historical Archives, there is an exhibition on the anniversary of accession of Greece's accession to the European community. And the second sentence that you get at the main entrance, the panel of the main entrance, is talking about the freezing of the association agreement. The European community was brave because there was a dictatorship over there, and the European community stood and denounced the dictatorship in rhetoric. On everything else, business as usual. Every single aspect that had been already defined previous to April 1967 continue unaltered. Continue to be enhanced from Brussels and the different capitals of the European. And the freezing element served for public opinion purposes, for building up this idea that the European community had an influence on dictatorships, in this case, in the Greek dictatorship. It was not only that. All right, so that's the second volume. And the third volume is basically a moving, and that is already written. That one is already written, has a different title. I'm not giving you the final title. I'm not giving the other one that to be, anyone to steal that title from me. So I'm keeping you the titles, the original titles of the books. I'm not telling you I'm not disclosing the original titles. The third one is basically has to do with, I'm keeping out the story up to transitions, to this political transition of Spain into democracy and the role of the European community. And here what we have is that once I was doing the research, something came out of the blue, and that was fisheries. When you talk about the Spanish transition, you're talking about politics all the time, talking about politics, you're talking about the constitution, you're talking about political parties, you're talking about the kind of things. Well, I'm going to prove you the fisheries, through fisheries, you can understand even better the role played by the European community back in those years in the political transition in Spain. And then I will also expand that to Greece and Portugal. So I will continue with the Greek history and the Portuguese history. Now, this is what I say is a long-term research which I initiated years ago. Now, the book is a long book. It's 400 pages. It's a long book. You don't need to read it all. There's no need to do that. There's no need. Just get the introduction. Get the introduction. The introduction goes from page 1 to page 26, 27. Get the introduction. In these 27 pages, you have it all. You have the entire story. That's what I do in my books. What I do is I tell the reader, listen, this is my story. This is basically the concept. This is the core argument. This is the comparable research. And these are some elements that you have to take into consideration. You get that, and you skip everything else. When do you go to everything else? Once you read the introduction, you say, I can't believe that. It cannot be true. Just can't believe that. It just cannot be. Just go to the corresponding chapter and you get the evidence. I mean, this book is basically contra-intuitive. You will have an idea made in your mind. This book is going to destroy it all with complete, detailed information. I didn't know anything about this book before I wrote the book. I'm not an expert on this thing, and then I have written a book because I'm an expert on it. No, it just happened that I was getting the documentation, I was getting the information, and the book came out with all these elements, of amazing surprises. Most of the contents of this book are absolutely unknown in Spanish contemporary history, absolutely unknown. Nobody knows anything about that for two reasons. One, which is extremely important, is basically because this is not the case in this research institute. It is not the case here, but it's the case elsewhere, in which historians are hyper-specialized. And therefore, they just go for, let's say, political historians are doing political history. And whenever you get any sort of technicalities or any sort of economic history, any sort of whatever, they push it aside. This is not my field. I'll leave that for economic historians. I'll leave that for cultural historians. I'll leave that for, and they just, this is not the case in this institute. So, but I mean, if you go outside of this institute, you go to many other universities, what you get is that historians, political historians, contemporary historians have hyper specialization, and technicalities basically simply are not, they do not appear. And the devil is hidden in technicalities. And when you get all these special technicalities, when you just dig in and try to measure, because one of the things that I do, and that is my specialization, is that I measure. The first book, which was the Spain and the reconstruction of Western Europe, what I measured was basically the isolation of the Franco regime. The idea was basically that the Franco regime came out of World War II and it was isolated and discriminated. Well, I measured that. And the conclusion was that there was not isolation, there was no discrimination. It had a special situation, no doubt about that, but exclusion does not exhaust everything. Not being member of the Marshall Plan, not being member of the European community is the point of departure of my research. You are not member of the European Union. What happens? What happens? But you have institutional relations with the European community. How do these institutional relations affect you, support you, transform you, pressure you, help you, assist you? That's what I measure. What I measure is basically that, and I have to do that using very sophisticated technicalities. And whenever you have that, then people will just go away. For instance, the first chapter in this book, which is Spain and the European Coalition Community, read any Spanish history book, any. There is no one single reference to that. And it's a fascinating chapter. It is a fascinating chapter. It's the most beautiful chapter in the entire book. It's not the most important one, but that has nothing to do. Importance and fascination are completely different things, right? It's the most fascinating one because it's the one that is absolutely brand new. When you say, you know, how could that be? Or how could that be? All right. Now, what's the concept? I'm talking about the European rescue, and that is a concept that was forged by this guy over here. That's Alan Milward, whom I guess you know. He died 12 years ago. He's an economic historian, very well-known economic historian. For me, is extremely influential to me. And he wrote that in 1982, the European Rescue of the Nation State. The concept of the European Rescue of the Nation State by Alan Milward is basically that those countries that came out of the war, the weak, democracies that came out of the war, all right, decided to pool some parcels of national sovereignty in order to facilitate their performance to satisfy the needs of the special constituencies that were necessary to legitimize the new regimes. Remember, I don't have to say that here in Greece, I don't have to say that in Greece. Remember the countries that the liberal regimes in Europe, all of them failed. All of them, except in the United Kingdom, all the liberal regimes in continental Europe, all of them failed in the 1930s and in the 1940s to protect their population and even their frontiers. But basically, their populations, the lives of the people and the well-being of their people. Therefore, when you get the new brand democracies, these new brand democracies are extremely weak. They're very weak. They're very weak. And they need to build up national constituencies to give them support. In order to do that, in order to increase, let's say, your economic performance, in order to be able to finance social cohesion, in order to be able to maintain some degree of political stability, some countries decided to pool parcels of their sovereignty in order to solve problems that they could not solve on their own. All right? And now, Alan Milward was detecting that in 6 democracies, those that ended up building up the European integration process, European communities. But everybody was doing that. Everybody was doing that, no matter other democracies and even authoritarian regimes. Even weak democracies, strong democracies, Scandinavia, Greece after the Civil War, Spain, Portugal, everybody was trying to do exactly the same. We are trying to identify the sources of their social, political, and ideological support, and they were trying to provide basically to satisfy the basic needs of these groups in order to maintain their support, and that will give them stability in the long-term process. Everybody's doing that. Now, these guys were extremely intelligent to do it in a very brand, completely new way, which is pooling parcels of sovereignty. Everybody else, no matter what point in time, everybody else is going to have a relationship with the European community, with European integration, in order to support their policies of reconstruction and development in the long term. We're talking about Greece, we're talking about Spain, we're talking about Portugal, we're talking about Scandinavia, or we're talking about the United Kingdom. It didn't matter. So what I'm doing is that I'm using the European rescue concept, not for democracies, but in this case, for an authoritarian regime, because the authoritarian regime is also willing to negotiate parcels of sovereignty in order to get the necessary support to provide for the need of those who are their main constituencies, all right? So the Franco regime is going to initiate extremely early, exactly the same as Greece, negotiations with the European Economic Community, all right? Now, my book should have been published 10 years earlier, but I was involved in this project. There was a huge project on Alan Milward, on the legacy, the intellectual legacy of Alan Milward, and that was very useful. That was extremely useful because I couldn't move forward with my book. I just couldn't do it, so I had to put it aside and be dealing with this guy. And it was then that he made all these reflections that helped to get my work up to a higher level. So these 10 years of delay, which I was not mature in the book, I was not working on the book, the concept was being mature, and therefore that led to the European rescue of the Franco regime. Now, what's the argument of the book? Well, the argument of the book is simple, but extremely polemical. It's simple. And the core argument is extremely simple, is the European community, that means the governments, the national governments, acting towards Spain on the basis of the Council of Europe or the European communities, they assisted to sustain the Franco regime. The Franco regime will have not developed the way it did without the assistance provided by the European community. Now, that has two elements that had to be added here. One is the European community was not doing that on purpose. The European community was not realizing what it was doing. The European community did not design a policy saying, you know, we are going to have this guy because even if he's a dictatorship, even if he's a fascist, he's on our side. No. They didn't realize that. That's the element which is extremely fascinating. The European, and here we are talking about, when we talk about the European community, as of today, when we talk about the European Union, we need to be extremely careful whom we are referring to. Because when the European Commission speaks, it's not the European Union, it's the European Commission. When the European Commission says we are going to penalize Orban because corruption, this is a proposal by the European Commission. It is not a decision by the European Union. The decision has to be made by governments, and the governments can approve or not that decision. So who is speaking on behalf of the European Union? Well, this is a very controversial issue. Now, imagine 40, 30, 50 years ago. So here the problem is that what we have read in the books are the narratives that have been created, established by the European Commission and the European Parliament. But the European Parliament before 1992 had no competencies in any issue, foreign trade or foreign policy. So it was the moral conscience of the European community. The deputies that had no responsibility could just go there and denounce, right? That had an impact, no doubt about that, but they were not defining the policy of the European community, not even the Commission. It was the Council of Ministers, but the Council of Ministers of the European Union did not make public statements, made decisions which were public, but not public statements, right? So when we have all this rhetoric that we had and that we have on the books, this is basically the European Commission and the European Parliament, but not those who are making the decisions that affect the authoritarian regimes. This is the Council of Ministers. Then there's another element that you have to take into consideration, because this is the front line of criticism in my book. We have all these experts that come and say, you know, well, listen, the SPD, no, listen, the German government or the French whatever, or French Parliament, well, I don't care. I cannot care. How can I care? How can you gather the opinion of every single representative of every single European country in 30 years concerning Spain? Impossible. But it's irrelevant. What matters is the opinion that matters. What matters is not even the opinion, it's the action, it's the policy, it's the effectiveness of that policy. And here is the Council of Ministers making that policy. So what I'm doing is I'm analyzing these Western democracies acting through the Council of Ministers and making decisions concerning Spain. All right, then what you have is a national rhetoric, and that we know that. We have national governments address their national public, but then they go to Brussels and do a completely different thing. We know that in Greece. Happened many times in which what you have is a national rhetoric, a prime minister saying X and going to Brussels and making a decision Y, which is a completely different opposite decision, right? So what matters are the decisions in Brussels. And now the thing is that the European community, it was genuinely thinking the idea that the closer you get to the European community, for some sort of magical force, you will be transformed into a less repressive, more representative, more liberal government. This is how Angela Merkel justified German energy policy towards the Russian Federation. The idea was all the time confronting the calls for a boycott on the Russian Federation from the very early times. We don't have to wait until 24th of February 2022. That had happened already in 2014, 2004. There were many polls for that. Angela Merkel was all the time saying, no, wait a minute. If you boycott, if you just get into that, they will just go away. It will be worse. So if we keep that relationship, if we keep that dependence, that means that Putin will appreciate making business with us, and therefore he is going to transform and be more representative and less repressive. Well, we know what happened. Exactly the same happened in the 1950s and in the 1960s and in the 1970s. There is one exception to that, and that is the Greek junta. In that specific case, they knew what they were doing, and they were not doing that. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were just counting that this episode was going to end pretty soon, and they was placing all the effort that the whole thing will just collapse, given the internal dynamics in Greece or the conflict with Turkey. They thought they would not have to do anything because that would be an internal collapse, and therefore they could just, what they had to do is just keep things running. And the Greek junta tried their best not to face any problem. They tried to be good boys concerning the European community, not to the Greek people, but concerning to the European community, in order not to have an overreaction from Brussels. So this is a very specific case, and I will develop that if you want to. So the thing is that what we have is that the European community is willing to negotiate with Spain. Now the question is, how do you do that? And that is an extremely complicated issue. And there is sort of episodes which are extremely important, because the decision is not made one day, Monday morning, 8 o'clock in the morning, say, no, we are talking about a cascade of decisions. And one decision is leading to the next one is leading to the next one. And there is some degree of predetermined sort of program of action concerning, let's say, Franco Regime or other dictatorships. The European Union doesn't have that. That's a problem. We do not plan ahead. The Chinese planned 100 years ahead. We just planned 3 months ahead until the next European Council meeting, which is the European Union cannot have that sort of long-term perspective, right? So initially what we have is, and that was 1964, the decision was basically to abandon the sort of fascist rhetoric concerning the Franco regime and allowed the opening of negotiations. Now, for that to happen, what we had is extremely competent Franco regime administrative personnel. Dictators might be dictators, they might be cruel, they might be brutal, but not necessarily stupid. And the Franco regime, remember, ended because the dictator died from natural death on his bed. All right? So we're not talking of Portugal, we're not talking of Greece. In the case of Spain, what we have is a dictator that he stayed in power, full power, until the very last hour of the entire regime. All right? So the thing is that we are going to stop this rhetoric and we are trying to find how we are going to collaborate, how are we going to try to find that solution. The Spanish administration is going to give them the key. They're going to give them the key. They knew exactly how the European community behaved. They knew exactly what they had to do. And they did it. They did it with enough ambiguity that allowed the European community to get one part of the whole thing and just proceed. That was the first decision. It is an extraordinary phenomenon. And you will get episodes which are absolutely fascinating. You know who is Henry Spaak? Henry Spaak is a prime minister of Belgium, minister of foreign affairs. He is president of the European movement. He is one of these Europeanists. I mean, one of these saints of European integration. I mean, he was holding the permanent chair, or not the permanent chair, the temporary chair of the Council of Ministers. In 1964, he had to reply to the Franco regime. had to reply. The Franco regime had launched a request for association, and they had to reply. Now, SPAC wrote two responses. One, this is a fascist guy. There's nothing we can do with that. You need to get a democracy. That's draft number one. That he never put to the vote of the council. That he's translated to his parliament. Draft number two, all of that had gone. And the only thing that is there is that the European community is willing to open negotiations in order to find the most adequate solution to whatever problems the European, Spain has with the European community. That's the second draft. That's the one that went to the European Council and it was approved by the Council of Ministers. Now, this second draft, this guy is the most anti-Franco person in Europe at that point in time. It is the most anti-Franco guy in Europe for many reasons. War, fascism, for many reasons, personal and political reasons. The most anti-Franco guy in Europe. Well, he called the Spanish ambassador, fascist number one, called the Spanish ambassador and said, why don't you write the draft? And the Spanish ambassador wrote the draft, went to the Council of Ministers, and that was the draft that was approved to reply to the Franco regime. That is absolutely unknown in the Spanish historiography. Now, once you have that, the thing is, once you have decided that you have to give it the preference, now how are you going to do that? How do you give preference to the Spanish regime? How do you do that? Well, they did it. They did it basically on the basis of a new nomination. Remember, Greece has an association agreement with the European Community. That association agreement was the most frustrating agreement ever reached by the Greek Republic. It was frustrating from day one. Even before it was signed, it was frustrating. It was frustrating for the Greek negotiators. Well, in the case of Spain, Spain didn't want to follow the Greek way, and they decided to invent a new special regime. And that special regime was preferential, a treaty that was a trade agreement that was in nature of a preferential nature. And that agreement, there was a trade agreement. When you read the literature, what you get is the Greek, they got the right, because they were a democracy, they got the right to treatment and association. The Spaniards, because they were a dictatorship, they got what they could, a trade agreement. Well, that trade agreement was extremely more beneficial for the Franco regime than the association agreement to Greece. It was that trade agreement basically fulfilled every single request of the Spanish government. What were the requests of the Spanish government? Not very similar, not very dissimilar to the French, to the Greek. First, full access to the community markets for industrial products. Second, non-discrimination on agricultural products. Third, no political conditionality. And fourth, basically to limit the opening of the Spanish market. Well, the community granted everything. They granted every single thing. By 1970, everything had been granted to the Franco regime. The most important element was there was no conditionality whatsoever. No conditionality whatsoever. From 1950, from 1970, when the agreement was signed, it was unsatisfactory for everybody. So they had to renegotiate, exactly the same as the Greek. Exactly the same as the Greek. When they finished the negotiation of the association agreement, they just started new negotiations because they wanted to get access to the common agricultural policy. They were not allowed to do that. They wanted to have more economic development assistance because they granted something like 125 million. They wanted to get more than that. Spaniards were not asking for any financial assistance. They knew that was a hell of a problem, so they avoided that. The Greek didn't know that, and they just got into that big trouble because of that. The thing is that from 1970, what we got is, let's say, twofold sort of renegotiations. On the case of Spain, well, Spain soon discovered that there was nothing they could get better than what they got. There was nothing that the European community could give to them, being a dictatorship. Obviously, membership was out of the scope because of Franco. I mean, Franco was not willing to get membership. So what the Spanish did from 1970 onwards was basically to pull the leg of the European community, because they were waiting for the biological end of the dictatorship. So what they did is for 5 years, they just going around and around and around and around and around, and the European Commission couldn't do anything, because they had granted everything from the very beginning. The European community had granted everything from the very beginning. They made that big mistake because they thought that being so powerful, we are talking about the six wealthiest European democracies, and we are talking about a fascist regime, underdeveloped economy, ostracized political regime. I mean, the bargaining power was so out of equilibrium. So the European community, they thought they could press the Spaniards to change. Well, the Spaniards did not give in. So they managed to continue and to maintain the trade agreement until 1985. Until 1985, in which Spanish exports, industrial exports to the European community went like that, boom. Total exports, industrial exports, boom. Spanish imports from the European community, like that, were absolutely stagnated. How could they do that? How could they do that? What was wrong there? Well, point number one, the Spaniards were extremely competent. They might be a dictatorship, but they were extremely competent. And the European community extremely negligent, because they thought, well, I mean, they're poor, they're underdeveloped, they're fascist, we can manage them. No, they obtained everything. They made a list in 1964 saying, this is what we want. A, B, C, and D. They obtained everything. What happened with the European community? What happened with the European community is the opposite side. What happened in the European community is that the frustration was growing by the day. Every day they were more and more frustrated. This is a big difference with the Greek case. In the case of Greece, they stood to the letter and the spirit of the agreement. There was no deviation. There was no deviation. I mean, the agreement was very simple. You cannot deviate much, but I mean, there was no deviation whatsoever from 1961, 1962, up to the beginning of the negotiation in 1973. There was no deviation. In the case of Spain, it was a complete unfulfillment. The community had granted everything. The Spaniards did not give anything. They gave a tariff reduction of 10% that they compensated with import quotas. There was zero. As a matter of fact, it is impossible that imports from the European community could stay like that. That means you have a lot of state interference, huge state interference. I have analyzed all of it, and it's going to be in the second volume. It's impressive, absolutely impressive. What is impressive is basically how could they fool the European community, how incompetent the European community could be. And this is the political consequences of that, is basically that concerning human rights, the European community was even more tolerant towards Spain than what any one of us would have wished. And why was that? Basically, because they didn't want to have an alibi in order not to get access on the Spanish market, because that was their main objective, to get access on the Spanish market. Spanish market, remember, Spain is the second fastest industrial economy worldwide after 1959, after 1974, is the second fastest industrial economy worldwide. What we have is an industrial market which is growing every single day, and we have something like 50 million potential consumers that had been underconsumed until that point in time because the market was closed and intervened. So for the European community, that was the new frontier. Spain was the new frontier. They wanted to get access, and therefore they wanted to renegotiate the agreement, and therefore they could not take human rights into consideration. Had they taken human rights into consideration, they would have blocked the negotiations, and therefore Spain would have just ended up the whole thing maintaining and retaining the trade agreement. Now, there is one element, that's the final element, I'll conclude here, and I open the debate. There's one element here which is important, and that's basically, how could that be? I mean, how could that be? Once you read that, once you read all these, and that goes on and on, once you read, well, that goes on and on when it goes on and on. Anyway, it goes on and on. Once you read that, you say, but how? Jesus Christ? Why didn't they put an end to the agreement? Exactly the same as gas imports from Russia or petroleum import from Russia. Why don't we put an end to imports if we are financing the war of aggression on Ukraine? Why don't we just stop that? First of all, why did we get into that? First, point number one. Point number two, once we are there and we are responsible for that, Jesus Christ, just for the sake of morality, stop. Well, we didn't do that. And as a matter of fact, what happened was that the European Council publicly renounced to the tool of denouncing the agreement with Spain. Therefore, the atomic bomb had disappeared, and the Franco regime continued killing until the very end of the regime. Until the very end of the regime. And this is the sad conclusion of my book. I'm going to stop here. I have many other things to say. I'm going to stop here. I gave you a lot of headaches, so you can react now, and we can just go into some sort of dialogue or a discussion or whatever. Okay? Go ahead. Thank you. Go ahead. Go. Just. We haven't stopped it. Go. We need to use this.
Yes, we need to use this for our speakers, for the questions. So here we are. It's always the case of the first question to start. Yes.
Thank you for the fascinating talk. I'm ignorant of the 20th century. Usually I stop to the First World War. You mentioned in the 4 dictatorships that had relationship with the European community, also Yugoslavia. Why we consider it a dictatorship? Why we consider it a dictatorship?
Because it was a dictatorship. It was a full dictatorship. I mean, you could say it was a mild communist regime. You could say it was transition. You could say it was a friend. You could say whatever you want to say, but it's a full dictatorship. No, it's a full dictatorship imposed by a guy by military force at one point in time, a military threat, and a combination of factors that maintained the personal rule over the country.
Can we consider other countries like Romania?
Sure. Yeah, but the thing is that they had no relationship with the European community.
Yes.
I mean, the element that differentiates Yugoslavia, in my case, with concerning the rest of Eastern European countries, is basically that Yugoslavia had a trade agreement with the European community.
Yes, my point is, in this respect, everything that is not the Western European style democracy is.
No, because Turkey, I'm not taking Turkey into my study. Because Turkey, you could just say whatever you want to say, but I mean, we might not consider that to be a non-democratic regime. It was a poor democratic regime, but so I'm not taking Turkey, but I'm taking Yugoslavia. Yes, Yugoslavia was a full dictatorship. It was considered as a full dictatorship by every single Western European parliament.
Thank you for your presentation. I admire you for speaking without any paper. Fascinating. Yes. Well, I had two questions until the last part of your presentation that you answered to one of them. I would ask, if you didn't already, that why do you put such an emphasis on the moral aspect of the European Union? It never meant to be charity organization. It was a cartel for coal and steel. Spain has a lot of iron ore, as we know very well, so it makes perfect sense that they needed that for their steel, of course, for their reconstruction. But you answered that, so next one. I saw something missing. I don't know if anybody else no. Where is the NATO aspect? Because if somebody, as myself and some of my friends here watch movies, we know a very famous movie named Patton, which is filmed in Spain, as many other films of Leone, for example, and they are specifically using two kinds of materials which Spain is famous for. German war material, they had it, German warplanes, plus the same time American tanks, okay? Patton tanks to be, to be exact. So where is the NATO dimension, and is it irrelevant to that?
First question, the moral issue. I bring the moral issue because the European Parliament is bringing that moral issue into the scene. All right. Now the Spanish government is saying, who cares? The Spanish government says, who cares? And then the Spanish ambassador at one point says, we should care. We should care because that is feeding public opinion. Public opinion could just revolt and pressure their governments, and their governments will give headaches in Brussels. So whether we just pay attention to the European Parliament and see whether we can just buy some of these deputies, as they did in the US Congress for the US basis in the early 1950s. They're following exactly the same pattern, right? So the moral issue is the European Parliament. The European Parliament, since the European Parliament has no specific role in foreign trade or foreign policy, the European Parliament is trying to get a moral dimension in which they have something to say, that defining this sort of moral dimension, all right? And that is a big issue over there. It's a big issue. And whenever we have debates in the European Parliament concerning Spain or concerning many other dictatorships, what we have is the European Parliament is split by half, all right? And then when you are fighting the Franco regime, then you will have the conservatives saying, well, what about the communist regimes on the other side? And when you're attacking the communist regime on the other side, then you will have the leftists saying, what about our dictatorships in the Western camp? So that was that sort of debate. Was some sort of a tennis table sort of debate in the European Parliament. The moral dimension is the European Parliament, and it's important. At the end, it's important because, as I will show you in the case of Greece, that moral dimension is going to trap the Council of Ministers at the end, and they're going to speed up negotiations, accession negotiations with Greece because of that, despite the opposition of the European Commission, despite the opposition of many experts, that they simply say that Greece is not ready for full accession. But the European community is entrapped with this discourse. They have been fighting the dictatorship. Whenever you are democracy, we will welcome you in the European community. So when that happens, then there is one episode which is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I have just discovered one guy I didn't know anything about, is Pezmasoglu. He was the main negotiator of the association agreement. He was ambassador in Brussels. Then he was minister, and then at one point in time he's minister, I think, with Karamanlis, with the post 1967 Karamanlis government. He is minister of, I think, he's European affairs or foreign affairs or something like that. All right. He's the first one going to Brussels once the end of the dictatorship, and he had been in Yale. Remember that the junta initiates repression on the members of ILA, members of the leftist parties, and then then goes to the center, then the conservative, and everybody. All right. The European Parliament and the European Commission starts reacting when Pezmasoglu goes in jail, a very specific jail. I can remember which one is it. Not when he was in exile. He was taken to some sort of islands. couldn't care less. Is when he's taken to some sort of headquarters of the political police, or security police. Then at that point in time, the European community starts getting quite nervous because he is called Mr. Europe. Mr. Europe in for Greece in Brussels. All right. So he's in prison. He's taken out of prison at the end. Then he goes to Brussels. And the European Commission, they're there, they are very nervous. They're very nervous because they know what's going to happen after that. They're extremely nervous. So they send the best members of the European Commission to talk to President Mazoglu. And they say, right, welcome to democracy, welcome to the European community. Now we start the association agreement. President Mazoglu, who had negotiated the association agreement, says, this is worthless. We are not going to go through that again. We want membership because you own us membership. That was your promise during the junta years, and now we want to negotiate membership. Now, the European Commission doesn't buy that. The European Commission opposes that idea, but at the end, it is the Council of Ministers that decided that it's time to negotiate for that. Negotiations were extremely poor, accession negotiations were extremely poor and extremely complicated, and I don't have any time to talk about that. Now, NATO. NATO is the United States. He didn't mention that, but he wanted to say, what about the United States and NATO? Well, the United States had a kind of pact with the European community. And the pact was very simple. They have a labor division. The United States will take care of security. You take care of providing the material assistance for economic development. I take care of defense. You do what you have to do, basically to improve the material conditions of all these countries, and that included Greece, Spain, Portugal, all the 10 Mediterranean. And you have to do that in order to get them tied to the West. Try to avoid any sort of honeymoon, any possibility of going to the left. All right? Now, the United States wanted Spain to get in NATO. But from the very beginning, they tried hard and hard and hard to get Spain in NATO. But Spain didn't want to get in NATO first, basically because knew that we were going to get opposition from Norway and the Scandinavian countries, and Norway was the only country that vetoed systematically, no matter what. It's not the same with Sweden or Denmark. Norway was the only one that vetoed, no matter what you could offer in exchange, membership of Spain of NATO. So the NATO dimension ended there. It could not be brought into the picture. And again, in my story, I have a story to tell. I'm not dealing with the history of Spain or history of Spanish foreign policy or history of Spain in the world. I'm not dealing with that. I'm not dealing with that. What I'm dealing is a very specific research question, which has a contemporary relevance, is how do we relate with dictatorships? How can Western democracies relate to dictatorships? What do we do? Do we trade with them? Do we negotiate with them unconditionally, conditionally, no matter the size, no matter the importance? What do we do? Shouldn't we take seriously that matter? Should we try to establish some frontiers of action? Should we try to introduce some degree of political conditionality? Should we try to get some degree of any? What do we do? Well, what this book proves is basically that we didn't know what to do with the Franco regime. The next one will tell you that we didn't know what to do with not only the Franco regime, but any dictatorship up to the mid-1970s. And then I don't know what happened afterwards. So this is the dimension that I'm dealing with, in which NATO and the United States is not there. The United States says, you know, you need to link and associate Spain, Greece, whatever, to the West. No, but how do you do that? How do you do that? How do we do that? It's extremely complicated. In the case of Yugoslavia, it's huge negotiations, Cold War, the Cold War scenario, you name it, military issues, NATO, oof. Everything is conditioned to the price of beef. When the price of beef goes down, That's the end. We have no Cold War responsibilities. We have no labor division with the United States. We couldn't care less. When the common agricultural policy is affected on a detrimental way, that's the end of the negotiations. But we have been talking about Cold War. We're talking about the responsibility of keeping Yugoslavia tied to the West. We have been talking about all these security issues until the beef price drops. At that point in time, that's the end of the entire negotiations. Full stop. So the question here is, yes, we want to do things. How do we do them? And here technicalities matter. Technicalities matter. This book has been delayed almost 10 years because of Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is the negotiation, the technical negotiation with the European community. It is absolutely incomprehensible. You know, it's an ocean of documentation. You have all technical details. You get mad. You get mad if you're talking about hundreds of products, hundreds of different instruments, and they're changing every single day. It took me years to be able to decide what was important, what was not important. The technicalities do matter. And here's where the European community has to delay, because all this requires a decision-making process, which is extremely complicated, because at one point in time, any country can veto. And that was France with the price of beef, as simple as that. Or Italy, when we are talking about, for instance, let's say, tobacco. We didn't need the United States. We have one member of the European Commission that was representative of a big tobacco community in Italy. And that was the end of it. I mean, whenever we have tobacco into the conversation, he will just veto. And that was it. And for the Greek government, it was extremely important. Tobacco was extremely important. It was the most important at that point in time. I think it was the largest item in foreign trade with the European community. Well, for Greece, that was important. Well, it was that guy representing that small community. And whenever tobacco, I veto that.
You talked about moral issue or apostolism, but I would opt rather for another term as an ideological and political issue, because I had a feeling, particularly in your answer, that there is a conception of a European Union that develops successfully to being more sensible to issues of democracy, to taking more into consideration moral issues than economic ones, which I don't feel is correct. Actually, I don't know, I'm not an expert at all at post-war Europe, but maybe we could suppose that it was not this ideological principles and this emphasis on democracy and on Europe as cradle of democracy and European Union is Europe, etc. All these arguments was not that important back in the 1950s than it is today. I mean, it's a matter of legitimizing ideology of an institution, and yeah, I don't know whether
you're perfectly right. We are covering here 35 years. 25 years, I'm sorry, 25 years, but I mean, including the previous book, we are talking about 35 years. At the end of 38 years of the Franco regime, the moral issues are going to change. Initially, there is no consideration whatsoever about any sort of, not even political issues at one point in time, all right? Now, but there is one element, but we, the European community, which is, remember, initially was all the time referred to as the common market, in the 1960s and in the 1970s, particularly the second half of the 1960s, are essentially the 1970s, wants to get out of this common market dimension, and it wants to generate also political discourse. A political discourse in which you get some sort of common values. The problem with common values is that there are no common values. The problem with common values is there are no common values. All right, I have a few anecdotes about that. We talk all the time about common values, but then you say, all right, which are the common values? Define the common values are impossible to be defined. But there is one element in political dimension and also in the economic dimension in which we all agree. And that is that when you are dealing with an authoritarian regime or a liberal regime or a dictatorship, what you could aim at It's not to that dictatorship to be transformed into a Fulbright democracy on Monday, but you can expect that if you're going to be making a lot of business with them and they are supposed to get a lot of benefits out of you, that you could say, well, you need to be less repressive and maybe more representative on the political side. And then on the economic side, you need to get a little bit more liberal policies and competition policies in your market, because otherwise we won't be able to do business. And it's a matter of degree. It's a matter of degree. Less repression, more representation. And what we have, and that's a fascinating aspect in this, is that what we have is a very similar situation to the situation nowadays. What we have is these dictators, and they're saying, no, 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 we're going to do that. Yes, yes. Well, listen, we are about to implement a law of political associations. These political associations will become political parties, and political parties will compete. And the Franco regime, this authoritarian regime, is able to transform itself into some sort of democracy. It will not be the French democracy or the German democracy, but it will be close. And the Germans, the Italians, and the French, well, you don't need to be like us, but you need to converge, all right? There is at no point in time a request that you have to be like us, because that was not possible. They thought, well, all we need is more representation. All we need is maybe a weak democracy, but some degree of democracy, some degree of accountability, some degree of political control, all right? So and the Franco regime is telling them that they're going to be doing that, which they never did. This is exactly the same as Orban. Orban has been for 15 years, promising reforms in order to end corruption. Hasn't done anything. Now he has promised a whole brand new program of reform to be implemented by the end of October. Exactly the same. No, the thing is, how do we behave? How do we manage that? That's extremely complicated. So the thing is that the European community is a very complicated issue, and the European Union is a very complicated issue. It has very clear instructions and rules concerning markets, but not that clear-cut rules concerning politics, because that's the nature, the original nature of European Union. Some are trying to transform that into some sort of political, and other ones are trying to delay that. And we have a whole debate. What we think in Greece is not the same as they think in Denmark. And that is part of the problem. There is no this common share values. We don't have them. We just don't have them. You have to go to the very basics. Let me give you an anecdote, which is fascinating. When Cameron had convened the referendum, and that was in 2016, in February, he went to, in December, he had a debate. And that debate, the opposition said, Jesus, you have gotten us into, we want to get out of an organization that has on the frontispiece that they will just go for an ever closer union. An ever closer union that will just be detrimental to the competences of the British Parliament. And the British democracy is rooted in the British Parliament. And therefore there is a contradiction in terms. Cameron said, I'm going to clarify that. So in February, he went to the Council of Ministers. And they said to his colleagues, he said, no, tell me, what do we mean? What is our common understanding about a ever closer union? All right. And in March, the Commission, remember that the Council, ever closer union, an ever closer union. That's the first, is article number 1 on the Treaty of European Union. Remember that the European Council is lazy and everything is done by the Commission. The Commission just prepares everything to the Council. So the Commission prepare a very nice document. Gee, very nice document in which they say they defined an ever closer union. Beautiful. Gee, beautiful. Really, really beautiful. You should just look for that. Beautiful, beautiful document. That document went in April to the European Council. And the European Council issued the answer to Cameron. And the answer to Cameron was the following one. We understand that an ever closer union is not A, not B, not C, not D, not E, and not F. The definition was by what they agreed not to be an ever closer union. There was no possibility of any agreement on what an ever closer union meant. So that tells a lot about common values, the weakness of that political dimension in the European Union. But on the other side, it is this lack of homogeneity that allows to have a house of 27 people thinking many different things that might be useful sometimes or might be not useful sometimes. But I mean, that's the phenomenon of the European Union.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask, wasn't there any reactions organized against this obvious and close relation between the fascist regime of Franco and European Commission of that time? And I mainly have in my mind the Spanish immigrants in Spain, in Mexico, mainly in other places.
Well, let me start with the second question, which is much easier than the first one. The first one is, oh my God. The second question is very easy. What we have is what we have in the, as you know, in the second half of the 1970s, what we have is a massive return of immigration coming basically from Western European nations. Now, and that was an extremely important phenomenon because these guys had been living in European democracies. And when they came, they were we have a strong labor movement in Spain at that point in time, as you had also in Greece during the transition. And they incorporated with themselves the sort of values that had to do with labor movements. And they were extremely important to give strength and to fortify the labor movement in Spain. That was extremely important at that point in time, and it was extremely important in the political negotiations. So the immigration that was returning to Spain was returning with some experiences, personal experiences, and some sort of European labor experiences and values. And they were incorporated that into the labor movement in Spain that had been really, let's say, closed under the Franco regime, as you can imagine. They were all there underground, so they have, they had this sort of limited. Their experience was basically an open fight with repression forces in Spain. So these guys had known better ways of doing that, and they incorporated. That was extremely important. There's a lot of studies concerning that. It's extremely important, particularly because let's say in the case of Germany, and that was the most important case, the case of Germany, what you had is a labor movement in Germany that was well conscious of that role, and they were training the immigrants, or the immigrants coming from, let's say, all these Southern European countries. They were just special training programs for them in order to facilitate political transitions after the dictatorship. And that was financed also by the political parties and the political foundations. That were extremely important political foundations in Germany. Okay, that's the first question. The second question is the learning process. Was there any learning process? Gee, that's a difficult thing because I'm not the one to respond to that. I mean, but I can tell you that I don't see any. But that doesn't mean that it was not any of that. What I know is that the European Commission is made of, is a college, but at the same time, you have very powerful individuals in the Commission, and they have their own political agenda. And some of them were extremely upset and unhappy with the sort of relations that we have had, that the European Commission and the European Union had with the dictatorships. One of the problems with the European Commission is that the European Commission, every time the European Commission moves out of the line, it gets a reprimand from the Council of Ministers, from the governments. And we have in the 1950s, in the 1960s, and in the 1970s, what we have is a permanent struggle between the European Commission that wants to be more of a political sort of a political government, in a way, political government with some sort of degree of independence, and the Council of Ministers is not allowing that. And we have that tension going on. And in that tension, what we have is the European Commission is all the time telling the Council of Ministers, this is not working, this is not working, this is not working, this is not working. These guys are not moving towards a democracy. This is not working. We're going to have problems in the future.
Thank you. You spend a lot of time comparing the Greek and the Spanish case in the relations to the EU. In the case of the Greek opposition to the military dictatorship, which was historically dominated by the left, I mean, the whole of them, from Social Democrats to the Communist Party to the far left, were opposed to the European Union, something that stayed like that until effectively the mid-80s. What was the situation in Spain? The opposition to the Spanish dictatorship, how did they think about this link between the EU and Spain? Second thing, if I understood correctly, you mentioned that you're looking also at the case of Portugal. So could we hear something about how it played out in this particular case?
All right. Now, concerning the difference, the situation is completely different in Greece and in Spain. In Spain, what we have is a full support of the European Union and the negotiations with the European Community and membership of the European Community. We have full support. What we have is 100 support. The chamber, the Spanish Parliament gives a full support to membership. In the case of Greece, as you know, the Socialist Party is going to oppose and is going to call a renegotiation of the terms of the agreement. In the case of Spain, what we have is basically that the entire opposition, the opposition are those who are going to be ruling the country. All of them are going to be ruling the country, all right? Because we are going to have some degree of coalition government at one point in time, right? And that is going to have, what we are going to have is a coalition government in order to define the rules of the game, the new constitution, the institutional system, and from there, the negotiations with the European Community. And everybody is going to be involved in the negotiations. Part of the negotiations are going to be taken by the Conservatives. The second part of the negotiations is going to be taken by the Socialists. The personnel, the administrative personnel is shared. It's basically the same, so they're sharing exactly the same people. And therefore, what we have there is a collective kind of effort to gain access to the European community. During the Franco times, the European community has become the symbol of democracy, well-being. We want to be like them. We want to be like these guys over there. Even for the Communist Party, because the Communist Party has understood, that there is a degree of repression which is more detrimental to them than capitalism. And that is basically dictatorship. So for them, overcoming the dictatorship, the European factor is going to be important, overcoming the dictatorship, and the Communist Party is willing to make two concessions. And these are not really concessions because they are integrated into their Euro-communism sort of evolution. One is the monarchy, and the other one is the European membership of the European Community. Now, in the case of Greece, I'm not an expert, but I'm coming to this conclusion. I'm not an expert. I need to work a lot on the Greek case. So allow me to be potentially critical here. In the case of Greece, we have a problem, and that problem is called Karamanlis. What's the problem of Karamanlis? Well, the problem of Karamanlis is basically that Karamanlis is going to identify everything with himself. Karamanlis coming out of the dictatorship. Karamanlis is going to speed up the process of the definition of the constitution and the new democratic regime without the necessary dialogue, national dialogue. It's going to be full speed. I'm amazed by the speed of political transition in Greece, but that is happening because he's got majority in the parliament and he is not taking the opposition into the play, and then he's going to negotiate the terms of the accession without any consultation with PASOK. So he's going to do that really in a fast track, and he's going to get everything, and then he's going to be identified. He his political option is going to be identified with all these options, the type of democracy that you got at that point in time, and the terms of accession to the European community. The Socialist Party, PASOK, was not involved into that. So the reaction got to be negative, and they were not involved, and the European community did not have the genuine intelligence to say to Karamanlis, you need to get a national dialogue, you need to get them into the negotiations, we need to talk to them, you need to incorporate them, because otherwise this is not a national project and therefore could be questioned afterwards. In the case of Portugal, it's exactly the same. The case of Portugal is very similar, because the Communist Party in Portugal is extremely has been radicalized with respect to the Socialist Party, and therefore the gap, the ideological gap, or the political gap between the Socialist Party and the Communist Party, I think is much larger than in the case of Greece. I'm coming to that conclusion, but I need to read a lot. And one of the problems that I have with the Greek case is that I don't read any Greek. I don't know why I'm doing this. I'm doing this because it just happened that I had to be involved with that. But I mean, I didn't have any intention to deal with Greece. I don't know any Greek. I cannot read. And most of the literature that I need is in Greek. So I have a problem. That's why I'm here, because I want to get some sort of degree of collaboration. Somebody here, which is in this period, try to get some sort of degree of collaboration in order to get a joint project, in order for me to help me to develop all these ideas with a little bit more detail. I've been talking with a lot of Greek historians. I'm fascinated, for instance, one of the things that I'm fascinated, Greek history is completely neglected in the rest of Europe, apart from the ancient times, apart from that, Acropolis and all that, recent, modern, contemporary Greek history is a big question mark, all right? So I was surprised by the level of political repression in this country from the end of the war up to the, let's say, 1964, 1965. It's amazing. Has no comparison in any European country after the war. Because I mean, there's an excuse for the civil war, then you continue with this special judicial regime. You could continue, maybe a couple of years. No, continue for more than 10 years. It's amazing. It's amazing, absolutely amazing. There was no one single guy in the European community, Council of Ministers, Parliament, or Commission that raised the issue of the weak democracy in Greece. They were all the time talking about the cradle of democracy. Jesus. And when you go and you see the political repression, how could that not be part of the negotiations? There was only one guy that was the European Parliament that raised the issue in the Belgian Parliament. Not in the European Parliament, in the Belgian Parliament. One. How could that be? But one of these surprises that the European, when you deal with, you enter into details and European integration, you get and discover. It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, I don't know, you know a lot about this period. How could that pass by without any sort of consideration? How could that be? It was.
I just want to say here that one of the great problems of Greek history and Greek historians is they talk a lot, we know about it, but we talk or they talk within themselves in wonderful Greek, which is a beautiful language. But the problem is that until 1980s, they were mainly Frenchly educated, and then there is this transition into English, but that went very low. So it is mainly economic historians we talk about, but not political, contemporary political history. And we have wonderful books, but we read them very well, just ourselves. Well, there is much more. I know.
Firstly, I'd like to thank you for your presentation. It was very fascinating. Secondly, I'd like to ask you, was it only, you talked about European negligence when they dealt with Spain and when they gave all these trade agreements so easily. was it just negligence? I mean, sorry, sorry to ask that very directly. The gentleman behind me talked about iron ore. You talked about the imports and the exports, the Spanish exports that went very high after the trade agreement. Was it just negligence, or was it a need, an economic or otherwise need for Spain?
Okay, these are industrial exports of Spain, right? That's industrial export in Spain. And that's the inputs from the European community. This is all inputs. Okay, so those markets that are more relevant for Spain were exporting less to Spain than the rest of the world. That has to have been state controlled. That is full access to the markets of the European community. Spain was doing this, but at the same time, it was controlling inputs. We talk about negligence. Oh my God! At the end of the book, I'm dealing with that. That's complicated. That's complicated. I say it's negligence because I say it cannot be intentioned. It's got to be negligence. That's the best thing you could say. Because if you say negligence, say, well, they didn't pay enough attention. Why they didn't pay enough attention? And there is several elements here. One is first, the speed of economic transformation in Spain. It was amazing. It was called the European miracle at that point in time. It was 1959, 1974. We were coming from a very low level. So at the very beginning, 1964, nobody was paying attention. Everybody was happy. So right, I mean, we get a potential market over there. Everybody was happy, but they couldn't realize that at one point in time, the Spanish car markets were going, the Spanish car makers were going to be competitive in the French market. It was when the French realized that they said, oh, no, we made a mistake here. We made a mistake, and then they started to renegotiate. They tried to renegotiate the whole thing. They couldn't do it, but they tried to renegotiate the whole thing. All right. So the first thing is basically that the speed of change. Okay, you could not anticipate that. Second is the speed of policy making. Some decisions were made in 1862. Spain was not a competitor. Were made. The most important decision was made in 1864. Spain was not extremely important competitor, and in 1967. It is after 1967 that everything has been decided and it has to be signed in 1970. There is a long inertia that is being built on the basis of perceptions of the early 60s. And the perceptions of the early 60s is a poor, rapidly developing, but poor economy. Not very competitive. The main concerns are agricultural products, as in the case of Greece. Everybody's concerned about agricultural products, but the Spaniards are intelligent enough saying, you know, we fool around with agricultural policy, but what we want is access to the industrial markets, because it's our industry that is going to make the transformation of the Spanish economy. That's what we want, not selling oranges. We want to sell cars, all right? So they just made that possible. That's point number one. Point number two, which is extremely important, is that the European community could not anticipate the capacity of the Spanish administration to implement import controls. It's amazing. The technical capacity of the Spanish administration to implement import controls is a unique case. And that could not be anticipated by the Commission and or the European Community. And then what happens is that the entire policy making was detrimental for the European Community, because in the case of the association with Greece, what you had is a very fascinating institutional mechanism in which you have I don't know how many committees, I don't know how many councils, I don't know how many you have, I don't know how many committees, but you have half a dozen of committees meeting to disagree. You have all these committees and they meet to disagree because there is no agreement whatsoever in all these committees. They had to go through all these committees. It's an ocean of documentation, getting to nothing. What they say is, no, Spain is a dictatorship. Therefore, we cannot have all these councils. What we're going to have is an annual meeting at the level of the technical level. Spain says, perfect, no problem. What happens? What happens is that the agreement is signed in 1970. The first meeting is in 1972. In 1972, the European Commission says, listen, Madrid, we are told that you are implementing some import controls which are not contemplated into the agreement. Oh, let me look into that. I'm going to look into that. All right. The next meeting in 1873. In 1973, they go to Brussels, and Brussels says, listen, what happened? Oh, gee, I forgot. I have forgot about that. All right, we'll do it next time. We get to 1974. In 1974, they go and they displayed a whole bunch of information which is absolutely relevant. But the commission takes all that. So, all right, the answer is going to be here. They go home. We are in 1975. When we get to 1975, all right, the commission says, listen, I mean, this is, so what are you talking about? We are going to be a democracy in a few weeks. But we're talking about the trade agreement. We want membership. Forget about that. We start negotiating about membership. And the European Commission said, no, wait a minute, wait a minute. How could that be? It is in the intonation of Juan Carlos I, because the European Commission has not sent representation to the burial of Franco. Is the intonation of Juan Carlos I, all right? The intonation of Juan Carlos I, in which you have the representatives of the commission sitting over there. You have the Spanish ambassador and the head of the European Affairs Committee in Spain. When the intonation ends, they stood up, and these guys went to the European Commission officials and say, all right, we need to talk about our membership. And the European Commission officials said, no, wait a minute. What? Yes, we want to talk about membership because we will be a democracy. The biological impediment is under a tomb. So that's the end of the problem. Now we want to, so that's what they did. So it was not, how would you define that? I define it as negligence. It might be another word for that. But the Spaniards were competent enough to fool the European Commission for 5 years. And they continued under the conservative government and the socialist government to pull the leg of the European Commission until the 1st of January, 1986. Believe it or not, that is exactly what happened. Is that negligence? Incompetence? I don't know.
I haven't read about it, haven't studied it, of course, but I have been always wondering how on earth could Franco survive for so many years in Spain? Having the experience of the Greek dictatorship, I said, where were the students? Where were the people to revolt against that? Where were they? What were the Spaniards doing? So I was wondering, does your book is a kind of answer to this?
There is a period of growth. GDP is growing. GDP per capita is growing faster. Very fast. What we have is a middle class which is growing and growing and growing, and they want stability. And in the case of the Franco regime, repression was extremely targeted. You could avoid repression, but not getting into politics. So the repression in the case of Spain is not like the repression in the case of the Soviet Union or the Communist Party, which is very, let's say, aleatory in order to keep everybody under control. In the case of the Franco regime, is very specifically targeted. So therefore, you could just avoid that by not getting into any sort of politics, and you could just go with your life without any kind of problem. The Spanish society was relatively open. We have millions of tourists coming into Spain every year. It was the fastest tourist market growing at that point in time. We have a free movement. I mean, we were not under any sort of limitation of movements. There was a lot of relationship with Europe and the rest of the world. and the political system it was considered to be an anomaly over there, that it will end at one point in time. And what Franco did, the Franco regime did, that was absolutely incredible, is basically that the Franco regime was able to launch a very simple message to the Spanish population and the Spanish business, is basically that they were able, the Franco regime was the only one able to get Spain into Europe under the right conditions. But right conditions, and the right conditions had to do with the protection of the Spanish market. That's extremely important, the protection of the Spanish market. Spain was an extremely protected market, and the Franco regime was the only guarantee to maintain that sort of protection. Once the Franco regime is ended, all that protection has to go away. Because of international pressure. And then what we have is all these industrial reconversion processes, which are extremely painful for the Spanish population.
So that the Greek economy as well had an incredible rise from 1950s to 1975. And it's 10%, 9-10% yearly development. And it was also a very protected market. So
it was much less protected. It was much less diversified. It was much less protected. Was much less diversified, and also the standard of living was slow. It was higher than in the case of was lower than in the case of Spain. The standard of living in Spain, despite all of it, was higher than in the case of Greece. Spain was much more. Is a much larger economy altogether. It's much larger economy. And therefore, and then we have, and what we have is basically the political repression. The case of the Greek colonels. At the end, it was extremely expansive. I mean, the repression was not contemplating any sort of limits. In the case of Franco regime, it was extremely limited. It was very specifically targeted, and that made a difference. That made a difference. Yes.
If you were thought that you were a communist, weren't you going to be sent?
No. You could be anything you wanted to. The only thing is you could not intervene in any action of violence against the Franco regime that could evolve into a violent. We have a lot of communists speaking up without any kind of problem in Spain. We have socialists, we have many opponents, but they had not, they could not intervene in any sort of, let's say, political action actively that targeted to remove Franco from power. You could be extremely critical with the Franco regime. There was no basically any problem.
I know it goes beyond the scope of his book, but you and Ms. Halafti talked about the specifically targeted groups in Spain. And I'd like to ask about the minorities, like the Catalans or the Basques. I'm asking just because I have a special interest. My grandmother was born in Barcelona. So I was taught that there was a sort of, let's say, targeting, I guess, against the minorities. Was it only when they were talking about independence, like the Basque groups did? Some, I'm not a specialist again, but or was it generally?
I mean, minorities, everybody was a minority. We have all labor movement was a minority. Some Catalans were a minority. Some Andalusians were a minority. The idea that the Franco regime was a regime that discriminated exclusively against Catalan and the Basque country, that is an invention. That happened, but it happened exactly in the same level as it happened with the let's say labor movement. Some of the communist regime in the south of Spain, for instance. I'm coming from Andalusia. Those who were, for instance, promoting land reform. They were occupying some of the big tenants, of the big properties of the big tenants. All of them were represaliated. But it had to be, they were targeted elements. For instance, some miners, when they were on a strike in the north of Spain, I mean, there were specific, obviously, there are episodes of cruelty in the case of the Franco regime, but it was not a permanent sort of situation. except for some of the communists. No, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Any other questions? No? Okay, we'll continue in dinner. So thank you very, very much for a lovely discussion. And I'm very glad we had representatives of all the community here, okay? University, the institute, undergraduate students, graduate students, postdocs, and PhD students.
The Franco regime is a sexy topic.
Yeah, if it was in October, we would have had more students here and many questions. Thank you so much. Yeah. Ευχαριστούμε και εσάς όλους και καλή μας ακαδημαϊκή χρονιά.